Yeah.
I might have.
On the ag side,
Oh, yeah, I was an ag econ major.
do you remember Kerberg?
Oh, yeah.
You remember his assistant?
No. Is that you?
Yeah.
I see.
Were you on a Purdue scholarship, or
No. I was a walk-on.
did you play something, or?
Yeah. Very little.
I remember I was a teaching assistant in that class, and mostly I graded papers. And yours were the worst in the class. And I thought, this kid will never graduate from Purdue. What? He must be playing basketball, mostly because that's the truth. I thought, well, I think part of the time you didn't come. But,
Wally, I never missed a class until I was a senior. Now, that gosh, I'm very
you were a
proud of
senior,
that.
I think.
I think it was home shaving.
Well, since then, he has become an eloquent speaker. He is a historian of great stature, and I heard him speak on World War II, and it was fantastic. And if you haven't, most of you may have heard him already, but he does a really fine job. I'm really amazed at how well he does. He is a history teacher at Kankakee Valley, and coach, and I don't know what else. And so let's talk about political campaign. Jerry Hoover.
I tell you how screwed up I am. I thought that I had shaved. And I was on the way over here, you know, I went and showered and everything, and I thought I'd shaved, and I was on the way to a dental appointment, went like this, and gee, at Christmas I haven't shaved. And so I had to go and buy a razor and so forth and so on, take care of this. Charlie Halleck, am I supposed to stand here so that? Okay.
Oh, he cares.
You here?
I care, I'm his dad.
Well, this presentation I've given before. I gave it at the from Arrowheads to Halleck, and I said at that time that it's a real shame when a person, the toughest job that any man has to do is to come and speak to an audience who knew a man and who they lived with, and then I'm from Monticello, and I come here to talk about him. I'm not in very good shape, I don't think, in this particular setting. What I'd like to do tonight is we're going to talk, I'll give you about an hour of Charlie Halleck's life. And there'll be, I've tried to get some of the quotes from the campaigns and some of his philosophy about political campaigns, because I know that's important. And then the second hour, or the second 45 minutes or so, Carol Beaver and Kenny Culp will join us, and we'll just sit here and we're going to tell Charlie Halleck stories. And so I hope that that'll be interesting to you, and I hope this presentation will be interesting. Charlie Halleck was born August the 22nd, 1900 in DeMotte. He was named Charles Abraham Halleck. His father was Abraham, his mother was Laura. He always said that he was born with a political spoon in my mouth. I was born with a political spoon in my mouth. The Hallecks, Charlie's grandfather was James Halleck, and he was a nurseryman and a farmer in Kankakee County, Illinois. And then they moved over to Lake Village. And there was a great big lake about where Morocco's at now. As I can understand it, it was on the north side of Morocco, and it was called Beaver Lake there. And the Halleck, and then the people, the early people there, up until 1836, it was an Indian hunting reservation. It was in the treaties and so forth and so on. And then they opened it up to settlers. And once the settlers came in, then they dug a ditch from this Beaver Lake up to the Kankakee River. And the Halleck farm sat right in the middle of that ditch. The ditch itself was only 12 to 15 feet wide. And the Halleck household, now this is the grandfather Halleck's household, was up on stilts. The house was up on stilts. Charlie's father, Abraham, was born in 1860. And he was named, Abraham Lincoln had just been nominated for by the Republicans to be the presidential candidate, so they named him Abraham after Abraham Lincoln. He was, Charlie's father, Abraham, was one of 9 children. He was educated at, the father was educated in a one-room school at Morocco, and he got his teacher's license and taught grammar while in class at Central Normal College in Danville. Now that college has been shut down, but a lot of the people my age, if you you see, when I first started teaching, there were people who had gotten their degrees from there, and people that you heard about. He got his degree when he was 20 years old. So I interpret that he was teaching in the winter, going there in the summer, and teaching grammar school, and as was the custom in those days, why he got his degree in 2 years to teach. And then he studied law, and he studied under a judge in Morocco, and he passed the bar exam at the age of 24. He then moved to DeMotte, and he was in business with his brother in hay and implement and grain business in DeMotte, and he and his brother established the first telephone company in Jasper County. There was 150, they call it the Halleck Telephone Company. There was 150 miles of wire, and it went from Wheatfield to DeMotte and to Nyman. So Nyman was a lot more thriving then than it is today. Abraham Halleck was elected commissioner in 1896, and he served for 9 years. Now that's particularly important this year because we're studying the 100th anniversary of the courthouse, and he was instrumental in picking the marble and the wood and the leaded glass that went into the courthouse. He was very, very interested in that project. And in one of the sources that I read, it talked about the fact that some Chicago contractor was charging them too much for cement. And so old Abe went to work on him, and it went like from $1 a barrel for cement down to like 5 cents a barrel after Abe got done with him. So there must have been graft in those days, and just as much as there is now. Mr. Halleck was a short, plump, slow-moving person who loved kids. And if you know anything about Charlie, he loved kids. In his last years, I was talking to Herbie Earhood, and he said that Charlie just loved kids, and he'd sit and watch them, kids in the neighborhood. Old man Halleck played a mouth harp, and he would get kids around him, and they would sing "The Bear Goes Over the Mountain" and different things like that. He loved to go on camping trips, and he took his whole family on camping trips. And a man by the name of Emil Hanley, who was the mayor of Rensselaer, said that old man Halleck knows every tree there is. He really was an outdoorsman. And of course, Charlie was an outdoorsman, and we'll get to that later. In 1903, when Charlie was 3, they moved to Rensselaer. And in 1908, Abe was elected state senator for White, Jasper, Stark, and Newton County, and he served 2 terms in that category. Charlie's mother, Laura, was called Bertie, and she married Abe in 1880. So they had been married 20 years when Charlie was born. Charlie was, there was 5 in the family. There was 3 girls, then Charlie, then Harold. And Harold was a doctor over in Winamac. Laura, before she was married, was a music teacher at the North Star School in Newton County. And she played the violin, the piano, and the harmonica. We'll notice later where Charlie inherited none of his mother's ability in the music area. She read law books and worked in the husband's law office, typed legal abstracts, so forth and so on, and then she was admitted to the bar. And so she became Abe's associate. And she was about 5'5", slender, quick mind, quiet, reserved. She managed a living-room house here in Rensselaer and took care of five children. And Harold, the brother, said that she was, quote, the power behind the throne. Charlie inherited his talent for practical politics from Abe, but his energy and his ambition from Bertie. Now, if we sum this up, both parents were teachers and lawyers. Both were conservatives. Charlie said this about his father. He said, quote, if Dad hadn't been so old during World War II, he would have been jailed for the things he said. He hated Roosevelt. I mean, the old man absolutely hated Roosevelt and thought he was the downfall of America. In Charlie's childhood, he was called Abe clear up through his college years because his name's Charles Abraham Halleck. It's recorded that he was a mischievous young boy. He threw worms at the girls, pulled pears off of Mel LaRue's tree, and in the winter, there was a guy around here by the name of H.F. Parker, and he wore a big stove pipe hat, and Charlie and the rest of the boys would hide behind fences, and then as the hat went by, they'd fire snowballs at it and try to knock his hat off. He earned money by delivering the Rensselaer Republican. He got 10 cents a day profit, and he bought his first bicycle from that endeavor. He was the smartest boy in his class. In the 8th grade, he had 19 A's, 4 B's, 2 C's, and 1 D. The D was in music. In Rensselaer High School, and I think this is really interesting because I'm a critic of the public schools today and I don't make any bones about it, but let's look and see what this man studied in high school. He had 3 years of math, 3 years of English, 3 years of German, 3 years of history, 2 years of Latin, 1 year of chemistry, 1 year of botany, 1 year of shorthand, 1 year of typing. Where's weightlifting? Where's life skills? Where's all these other things that, my gosh almighty, we got kids running in and out of and so forth and so on, and I don't think it expands their mind very much. He got 32 A's, 10 B's, 3 C's. The 3 C's were in music. Extracurricular, he was a star debater. He was a high school cadet, and I think there's a picture. I got a picture of him, and it's either, well, see. But anyway, you're welcome to look at this. Carol Beaver and Jim Beaver have brought these here, but there's a picture of him here someplace in either his Army uniform. He was in the Army for a short period of time, but he's a sergeant, and so in this uniform. But anyway, he was in the high school ROTC. They called it something else then. And he got to be a captain. He was the editor-in-chief of the yearbook, and he was a good football player. I mean, a good football player. And I think that's interesting too. Rensselaer, Jerry, you can take this back home. But here's who Rensselaer played in those days. They played Kentland, Morocco, Kirkland, and Sheridan. And then they played Logansport, South Bend, and South Bend I know only had one school then, the South Bend Central. And they played Hammond. And Hammond only had one school, it was Hammond High. So they were lined up and playing people. And so I found that interesting. He did well in the county spelling bee. Again, academics, spelling bee, competition, until he ran into the word scarcely. And he flunked out here, he failed on scarcely. Harold said that the debate team was the start of the whole business. And he had a debate coach by the name of Mrs. Harriet Shedd. And she said that he was a very good debater and could think on his feet. And one of the things that I've done in my classes this year, I've been making kids get up and talk on their feet. You know, when I was in school, you had to get up and stand up, and now they lay back there about half comatose. And so because of this study, I've just made them stand up and speak at different times. And I think it does keep, it is a skill to be able to think and to be able to speak on your feet. It's something that I've never been very good at. Maybe better now, of course, as I'm so old, it's awful, but I think it's important. He enlisted in the military. Oh, one more thing. These debate teams went right along with the athletic teams. Like the Rensselaer, the RMD, the Rensselaer Monticello Delphi track meet, which is the oldest track meet in the history of the state of Indiana. They would go and they ran track, and then Charlie would quickly change and run up and debate. Now, you know, we'd never get that done today, because the first thing that happened, you'd have to have, my guys, the debate coach would be mad if he had to ride on the same bus with the track coach. And the track coach would be mad if he had to ride on the same bus with a bunch of academic folks. And then we'd have to have separate buses for each of those, and then we'd have to have another bus to take the fans along. And so, you see, they were, I think, interested in the taxpayers' money in those days. Charlie, as soon as he finished high school, he enlisted in the military in 1918. And he rose to the rank of second lieutenant infantry, but he never served in, he served in the southwestern United States. Now, I really have never figured this out, because he also, in 1918, enrolled at Indiana University in September. So his military service had to be pretty short, but of course the war ended. There wasn't any reason for him to be around anyway, and so they must have discharged him pretty quick right after the war. He went to Indiana University, and he's a boarding house. He started out in a boarding house, and so he didn't have very much money. 20 cents would buy you all that you could eat, and all you could eat for 20 cents. And in freshman rush, he wanted to be in a fraternity really bad, and in the rush process, they didn't pick him up. See, because he wasn't rich. And he came from Rensselaer. It's a poor boy. And he wrote home to his mother, and I think this really says a lot. He said he was brokenhearted because he didn't get picked up by a fraternity. And it says, it takes, quote, "It takes a lot of pull from some prominent member. One must smoke, swear, shoot craps, and throw quarters for the crack in order to get into some of these fraternities." And he thought of himself as being too slow mentally, a slow person mentally. And then he thought about his physical appearance, and he thought maybe he didn't look good enough. And so, you know, that would, a lot of boys would just to come home. But you know what he did? He joined he was determined to succeed. He joined every single organization that he could join on that campus. And by the time he was a junior, he was elected president of the student union, which is a very prestigious job in Indiana University. And he was also, as a junior, Phi Beta Kappa, which is the scholastic honorary. So in his junior year, guess who came around looking for him? The fraternities. And they signed him up. Beta Theta Pi, which was the best fraternity on campus, recruited him, and he became a beta. Two fraternity brothers, Wendell Wilkie and Paul McNutt, we will hear about later. But this was the big fraternity on campus. He fired furnaces, waited tables, and when he came back here to Rensselaer in the summer, he worked at hard labor. He was one of 3 people selected by Indiana University for the Rhodes Scholar, to be a Rhodes Scholar. And he did not make that, but he was selected by the university for it. He was too busy with all these other things for the girls. Did not have romantic inclinations. There was a young lady that he ran into at Butler, and they went for a long moonlight walk. And she came back, and they said, her roommate said, well, what happened? And she said, nothing, darn it. All he talked about was being President of the United States. So he had that on his mind, see that? He did meet Blanche White, and she was much more receptive to Charlie's style of courting than the girls at Butler. And so they hit it off, and eventually she became his wife. They would go down to the place in Bloomington where Hoagie Carmichael played. Now I want to tell you, I look around here and I see people of the age who know who Hoagie Carmichael is. Now I tried this out on my classes. I said, how many people here know who Hoagie Carmichael is? Nobody. I said, how many of you people have ever heard about Stardust? Nobody. If it's not Two Dog Night or some other crazy name for a band, well, they don't even know what it's about. He graduated 6th in his class of 450. In 1922, he entered law school. In 1924, he graduated from law school with the highest average in his class. And when he went to get his diploma, he had the filing papers for prosecuting attorney for Jasper and Newton County right in his pocket, and he walked up there and got his diploma and showed it to the boys, you know, what he's planning on doing. And he came home and ran for prosecuting attorney and was elected. He got 3,755 votes. His opponent got 1,875 votes. So he just about doubled it on his opponent. He was a prosecuting attorney in Rensselaer and Kentland for 10 years. And he strictly, see, Prohibition was in there. 1924, you got Prohibition. And they had a little deal whereby if you caught a Prohibition guy and got him convicted, you got $25 bonus. So he and the sheriff would hide out because, you know, people from Indianapolis to Chicago, they're the rum runners and the bootleggers are running back and forth here and over by Kentland. And so they'd hide, and if they saw anybody suspicious, well, they'd haul them in and do their duty, but also collect the $25. And he made the statement, of course, anybody that knows Charlie Halleck knows that he drank. He said, I was as dry then as I am wet now. So, he was married to Blanche on June the 15th, 1927. 2 years later, they have a boy and a girl, Patsy and Chuck, and there was their only children. Now, how he got to Congress is really interesting. You see, in the coaching business, they say, coaches will tell you, I'd rather be lucky than good. Rather be lucky than good. And I can tell you that the thing that I see here in Charlie Halleck's life is that he might have been lucky, but he was ready. He was ready. He, as prosecuting attorney, he took every opportunity he could to speak anywhere, anywhere. And he spoke to groups as large as 5,000 and as little as 5. Didn't make any difference. If you wanted a speaker, he'd come and do it. So, here's the circumstances that came about that he got to be a congressman. There was a man by the name of Will R. Wood, and Will Wood was an outstanding congressman. He had been in Congress for 12 years, and he was able to, in the census of 1930, he got the state legislature to carve out a nice congressional district for him, Republican, and he figures, I'm going to stay there for the rest of my life, because they gerrymandered it and got it all fixed up for the Republicans. But then the Depression came along. Now this is in 1931, something like this. Now the Depression comes along, and Will R. Wood gets beat. He just got swept out in the Roosevelt landslide. So because of that, there was a man by the name of George Drugan, who was the mayor of Lafayette, and he served a two-year term. Well, then in 1934, a man from Logansport by the name of Frederick Landis ran, and he beat Drugan. He was a Republican, and he beat Drugan. And then 9 days after the election, he died. Who was ready? Charlie. So now Charlie gets himself, the county chairman get together, and I won't go through all that, but nevertheless he got himself appointed to the Democratic side of the House, and then he runs against Drugan, see, because Drugan is the Democratic choice. We said we would remember the name Paul McNutt. Well, Paul V. McNutt was the governor. So he set the election day, the special election day, he set it on Roosevelt's birthday, because he figured that Drugan was a shoo-in against this young upstart from Rensselaer, and then he wanted to call Roosevelt on his birthday and say, Mr. President, we have an additional present for you, blah, 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 blah. Well, the campaign was very dirty. The two groups that came to Charlie's aid, the Democrats accused him of everything and under the sun, and the two groups that came to his aid were the lawyers, came to his aid, and also the American Legion. And McNutt had everybody that was on the state payroll putting 2% into the pot. They called it the 2% Club. And he spent, you see, there was only one election, so he spent a lot of money against Charlie. And Charlie said that he'd rather have one good volunteer than 10 of those Paul V. McNutt henchmen working out there. He won. He got 50,325 votes. Drugan gets 45,000. Here's an interesting fact. The campaign cost $7,000. $7,000 got a man elected to Congress in 1935. $2,000 came from Charlie's pocket, and $5,000, George Ball, the Muncie businessman who's the founder of Ball State University, gave Charlie, well, he wasn't the founder, his father was the founder, but he gave Charlie $5,000. And his friend said, you just threw $5,000 down a rat hole. And Charlie came through and he won. They had a big celebration. Never had a congressman from Rensselaer, and he had a big celebration up here at the courthouse, and he got so fired up that he threw his hat into the bonfire that they had. It was February night, you know, and so he won, and so he threw his hat into the bonfire, and he went off to Washington. He was sworn in on Tuesday, February the 5th, 1935, and on February the 12th, he returned to talk to the Republican Editorial Association in Indianapolis, and one of them asked him, he said, well, what does it feel like being a Republican among so many Democrats? Because you see, there was very few Republicans in the Congress in 1935 because of the Roosevelt landslides. And Charlie said, well, he said, I feel like a Betty Rooster turned loose in a barnyard with a whole bunch of horses. He said, I looked around and called them together and said, now, gentlemen, let's be careful about stepping on one another. He made his first speech on March 11th in the Congress, and he opposed making income tax returns public. He was instrumental in getting Landis's widow $9,500, which would be the same as his salary at that time was $9,500. He voted with the Democrats on veterans and Social Security issues. And this is, you're going to see that as he becomes a senior member in the Congress, he was the guy who got the Southern Democrats and the Republicans together to form a coalition in the House that was then able to defeat a lot of legislation that Democratic presidents and other presidents wanted. He was absolutely against the New Deal. Absolutely against the New Deal. Here's some of the quotes. We've got 114 new federal agencies. We got 250,000 new federal employees. Billions spent on unworkable, unconstitutional enterprises. $22 billion spent, 12 million still unemployed. We need less government in business and more business in government. Halleck's enemies called him Halleck the Smart Aleck. because of this. He could really speak. He was a great stump speaker. And then they said, Rensselaer, ditch lawyer, dredging up more mud. Another quote from 1930, I think 34. Quote, if the Democratic platform had measles, the New Deal performance never got close enough to catch it. 1936 he runs. He runs against Hugh Barnhart, a Rochester newspaper editor. He wins by 5,000 votes. Now I want you to remember these, we're going to go through 17 elections here. But the first election that he runs, won the first one by 5,000, now he wins another one by 5,000. But when he goes to Washington, there's only 88 Republicans in the House. 435 members, and there's only 88 Republicans. I got a quote for you from, this was in the Rensselaer, I think the Rensselaer Republican. Yeah. He explained how he became, how he was the representative, Indiana's representative on the House Republican Committee on Committees and the National Republican Congressional Committee. He was the only one there, see. So he said, I called a caucus of the Indiana Republican delegation and picked out a fancy telephone booth for the meeting. It was all very informal. I didn't have to rap for order once. And I disposed with the formality of selecting a delegation chairman. I jotted the minutes of the meeting on the walls of the phone booth, picked up my own committee assignments, and walked out. Meeting adjourned. Now, my experience with Charlie Halleck was that, see, when I was working my way through Purdue, in spite of what Wally says, I did work my way through Purdue. And I worked at the Sportsman Restaurant. And Roy Conrad was the state senator, was a senior state senator in the state of Indiana at that time. So I was working in a restaurant. And so as soon as I got to be 21, I wanted to wait tables, because that's where the money was at. And Charlie Halleck was in there all the time. And so my experience with Halleck is based on that. And I've heard him speak many times. He had a lot of meetings at the Sportsman Restaurant in Monticello for precinct committeemen and different meetings. He had a lot of meetings there. I don't know where else he had meetings, but I know he had a lot of them there. And he always came back to this phone booth story. He'd say, by gosh, we don't want to be in a situation where I was when I first went there. He said we could hold a Republican caucus in a phone booth, and he said we had room left over, you know, and he said if we don't get busy, we'll go right back there to that same state again. But he always talked about the phone booth and the Republican caucus in a phone booth. He moved up rapidly in the Republican Party because there was only very few of them around. And so he got good committee. Roosevelt, if you remember history, in 1936, after the election, Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court shot down a lot of his New Deal legislation. And when he tried to do that, he really made a lot of enemies, particularly the Southern Democrats. So Charlie, again being ready, he hopped right in there and got the Southern Democrats. He sided in with them and kept the Republicans together, and even though he wasn't in a leadership position, he started this coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans, which was to bear him so much good in 1936, right after Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court. In 1938, farm prices were 25% lower than 12 years of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. Here's what Charlie had to say about that on the campaign trail. Let the New Dealers explain 20-cent oats, 30-cent corn, and 50-cent wheat. His opponent was Thomas Stonebreaker from Cass County. And he won now. See, he's out of the woods now. He wins by 21,000 votes. And you'll see here that he just keeps winning. He wins just one, always by a lot. There was one election, I think the 14th election, where he didn't have that quite that. Joe Martin becomes the minority leader of the House. And Halleck was his trusted aide. He got a seat on the Rules Committee. I got, I think, another quote here, 89. Here's another quote from the campaign trails. "After 6 long years during which we have spent billions of dollars, which we did not have, 10 or 11 million unemployed are still tramping the streets seeking jobs in vain. They are becoming more desperate as time goes on. They are becoming more and more insistent that their government and their society provide real jobs in legitimate business and industry." You see, again, he doesn't like the New Deal. 1940. The Democrats now concede that the 2nd Congressional District, they're just conceding it. And they put an ad in some of the newspapers and it said, "Wanted, a candidate to take a drubbing from Mr. Halleck." '40 was when he finally gets on the national scene. This is when he first starts to get on the national scene. And there were, in 1940, there were 5 presidential candidates in on the Republican side of the House. Roosevelt, of course, was going to run for the Democrats. Dewey, who was the New York governor. Taft was from Ohio. He had been a senator for 2 years. Vandenberg was from Michigan. Joe Martin was a House Minority Leader, and he was mentioned in this select group. And then Wendell Willkie was an industrialist, and he really was a lawyer, was what he was. Dewey was a choice of 67% in a poll taken on April the 23rd, and Willkie only had 3%. But Willkie was continuing to gain strength. Now on June the 12th, Willkie speaks at the Washington Press Club. And Halleck, who was his fraternity buddy, he says, "Wendell, if you're ready to run." Willkie had never come out and said he was going to run. But he said, "If you're ready to run, I'm ready to nominate you." So Willkie goes up, and in his remarks, he says, "I'm going to run." And he said, "My fraternity friend and my fraternity buddy and brother and good friend from Indiana, Charlie Halleck's going to nominate me." Well, they said that the press corps, there was no TV, nothing like that, just their telephones. It said that the press corps jumped up and knocked over chairs and ran out of the room, you know, and everything else, because, and this was on all of the headlines, that Willkie had agreed to run, and that Willkie was going to be nominated by Halleck. One of the Washington press corps said that Dewey was had the most delegates, Taft the most kingmakers, and Willkie the most enthusiasm. Willkie roamed I found this one really, this story to really be interesting. See, Willkie had been a Democrat, and he just decided that he was going to be a Republican for a while. So he was roaming the convention hotels himself. This was unheard of in those days. For him going around, he's shaking hands, wanting to get people to vote for him in the convention. He walked up to Jim Watson, who was a former Senate Minority Leader from Indiana. And here's the conversation. Willkie said, "I understand you're not supporting me." And Watson says, "No, I am not." And Willkie said, "Well, as we are both from Indiana, I hope that you would." And Watson said, "I will tell you why I'm not supporting you. You've been a Democrat all your life. I don't mind the church converting a whore, but I don't like her to lead the choir on the first night." Halleck gave a speech, and at first they considered him a traitor. The Republicans, you know, considered him a traitor. But Willkie had been very, very good in what he had done was pack the galleries at the convention. They had the galleries packed with Willkie people. And so as the convention process went along, why the crowd in the galleries kept yelling, "We want Willkie, we want Willkie, we want Willkie." And so Willkie finally won on the 6th ballot. On August the 17th, 1940, Wilkie opened his campaign. He was from Elwood, Indiana. And one of the great pictures in American politics is, Wendell Wilkie looks like a crazy man. Riding down the streets of Elwood, he's in the back of a convertible. I don't know if you've ever seen that picture or not, but his hands are up like this, and he had fuzzy hair anyway, and he was looking up like this, and he looked about half, crazy. And so Charlie rode around with him. And Wilkie had a poor speaking voice. His voice gave out. He came to Rensselaer and spoke on the courthouse steps of Rensselaer. But his voice was so weak he couldn't speak. So Charlie made the speech for him. And here again, he's available, see? So he goes around and he makes a lot of the speeches for Wendell Wilkie in 1940 on the campaign. He won the 2nd Congressional District by 24,000. And Wilkie lost to Roosevelt 26 million popular votes to 22 million popular votes. Wilkie and Halleck broke. They broke their friendship, and also they just broke because Wilkie voted against the draft and the extension of Lend-Lease, and Halleck was for both of those. Halleck's voting record was 59 out of 60 votes with Roosevelt, aimed at strong national defense. But he opposed measures provoking open conflict. In 1942, he ran against Emmett Ferguson from Lafayette, and here's was his campaign speech then. He said, quote, "The New Dealers were raking leaves instead of building defenses. And they were selling scrap iron and oil to the Japanese, and now we're catching it right back again." See? He won by 23,000 votes. He voted with the farm bloc, and he said that he was a telephone farmer. But I'll vote with the farm bloc. He became, here again, luck plays a hand. There was a man by the name of Bill Ditter, D-I-T-T-E-R, from Pennsylvania, and he was the head of the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee. His plane crashes and he's killed. Charlie's ready. He steps in and he gets to control $300,000. In those days, that was a lot of money for campaigning. And so he made sure he wrote every check and made sure that his name was on every check that a guy got that was running for Congress to help him win. He made sure his name was on it. In 1944, Dewey and Bricker was the ticket. Wilkie died in October. Roosevelt wins his 4th term. Halleck won over James O. Cox from Valparaiso by 29,000 votes, almost 30,000 votes. Halleck could have been Republican national chairman. They offered him the job, but he would have had to resign his seat in Congress. He didn't do it. 1946, Halleck was absent from the district almost all the time, but he defeated Margaret Aiflis of Delphi by 25,000 votes. The Republicans win the House and the Senate in 1946. So now, Joe Martin is elected Speaker, and Charlie becomes the Majority Leader. And I just want to read to you just a few of the things. A lot of people don't understand what a Majority Leader does. He is the acknowledged leader of the majority party in the House and is one of the most powerful men in Congress. He acts as a quarterback or field general on the House floor, ranks as the number 2 man in the House party hierarchy, and stands as the heir apparent to the Speaker. He is the party's principal spokesman in the lower chamber and is responsible for guiding the legislative program of his party through the House. He keeps the party unified by his temper and tone and can influence the course of congressional debate. He assists the Speaker with formulation of the legislative program, works with the various committee chairmen in order to keep informed on legislative progress, and encourages the reporting of bills judged important to the nation and the party. He must plan the House agenda and inform both sides of the aisle about pending legislation. The Majority Leader possesses little patronage power, and must depend upon wit and persuasion to win followers to his cause. The Taft-Hartley Act, Charlie Halleck hired a guy by the name of Gary D. Morgan. And Morgan and Halleck wrote the Taft-Hartley Act. Now, a lot of people don't know that. And there was, 3 or 4 years later, some Democrat got up in Congress and said, Charlie Halleck didn't have anything to do with the Taft-Hartley Act. And Halleck went and got his handwritten notes, and on the floor of the Congress waved them in front of the guy. He said, I had a hell of a lot to do with it, and waved it right underneath the guy's nose. His in his handwriting. Truman vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act, but then the Senate and House passed it over his veto and it became law. Another little known thing, Greece and Turkey was about to go communist, and Halleck and Truman were bitter political enemies. And Truman came to Halleck and said, we need $400 million to keep Turkey and Greece from going communist. And Halleck got it done. In 1960, now this would be like 14 years later, in 1960, Jack Kennedy stood up at a meeting in Washington where there were a lot of heavy hitters. And he said, I want to tell you something. Charlie Halleck saved Greece and Turkey. And recognized Halleck for his work in this area. In 1948, Halleck thought he was going to be vice president. He thought that he was going to be vice president. Taft and Dewey were the front runners. Dewey gets a nomination, and one of Dewey's men promised Halleck, he was Indiana's favorite son and had 29 votes in the convention. And they promised him vice presidency if he'd get those 29 votes for him on the first ballot. And he did it. And then what happened, Dewey held a meeting from 11 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the morning at a hotel. I think the convention was in New York. And the guys that shot him down, nobody knows for sure, but the 2 guys that shot him down from being vice president was Dulles and Vanderburg. Kept him from being vice president. And they put Earl Warren in there instead because he was from California, a bigger state, and they thought that would get him, they would get more votes that way. Well, first of all, Dewey came to Rensselaer, and that was his only stop in Indiana. Dewey lost, biggest upset in presidential history. And Warren did not carry California or any state on the coast. And Halleck said, Warren sat on his, and all the other stuff in the books that I've read, and so they didn't even quote, it just says blank, blank, during the campaign. So it must have been pretty strong language. Halleck always complained that Dewey did not talk about what the Republicans had accomplished in the 80th Congress, that the whole campaign, he just ignored that, and Halleck's advice to him was to do that. And so consequently, he felt that that he made a serious error there. The Republicans lost the Senate and the House, so Martin, Joe Martin, who was the Speaker, becomes the minority leader. So Halleck's out of a job. Now he could have bumped Les Aarons, who was the whip, right across and he's from Illinois, right across here in Kankakee. But he refused to challenge him because he was his friend. And so now Charlie doesn't have any committee assignments, and he's out of a job. But he was not out of influence. In 1950, Dale Beck ran against him. He was a dairy farmer from Logansport. He won by 19,719 votes, and Beck called him 2 Cadillac Charlie. I can remember that campaign, and I remember him talking about that. In April 1951, Truman fired MacArthur, and Halleck escorted General MacArthur to the podium for his Old Soldiers Never Die speech in the House before the joint Congress. In 1952, an interesting thing happened. Halleck supported Eisenhower right from the beginning. And Indiana was for Taft. There was a guy by the name of Cale Holder, who was the state chairman. And they locked Charlie Halleck out of the meeting at the convention. And Roy Conrad was in the room, and Beth Conrad told me that they locked the door. It took $500 to get in. And Halleck had his $500. They locked the door, kept him out. And so he did not have a seat. He was not a delegate to the convention in '52. So he didn't have a delegate. He wasn't a delegate, so what he did, he just went around and worked for Eisenhower anyway. And then a year later, he made sure that Cale Holder was no longer around Indiana as the state chairman. He managed Eisenhower's, he was on the list that Eisenhower gave to his people for being vice president for Eisenhower. And Roy Conrad told me that this is the way it went. Now, I haven't read this anyplace, but they said, they said that Eisenhower gave him a list. They said, well, who you want for vice president? And he gave him a list with 6 people on it. And the first name was Nixon. And so they thought that Nixon was his first choice. But Ike really said any of them will do. But they looked at the list, the guys that were in charge of that, looked at it, and thought, well, this is his first choice. Nixon's okay with us. And so, again, Halleck got nipped by just a little bit being vice president. He was the head of the Speaker's Bureau, and he managed Eisenhower's campaign trail. Halleck was the hatchet man for that campaign. And he did not, the opponent, of course, was Adlai Stevenson. He did not attack Stevenson, he just attacked Truman, who he didn't like anyway. So he just went after Truman because it was Truman's folly, as he said. He won by 40,000 votes in our district. The Republicans carried the House 221 to 214 in the Eisenhower sweep. And so, Halleck's again the majority leader, and Joe Martin is the speaker. By now, he's getting 600 invitations to speak annually. Mrs. Conrad told me that he was making far more money by this time speaking than he was as a congressman. That he was making 2 speeches a day and making a lot more money. He had tea with Churchill. He had dinner with Queen Elizabeth. And he had dinner with Nikita Khrushchev. So he's now up there with the very top. In 1952, how am I doing for time? Well, when Eisenhower's president, he is the legislative leader in the House. Halleck is the guy that Eisenhower calls over to the White House, tells them what they need to get done, so forth and so on, and then Halleck goes and gets it done in the House. And somebody wrote in Washington, I thought this was interesting, it said that Halleck's role was now supporting the president. And some pundit wrote, quote, "That sound of ripping and tearing that you hear in the background is old Charlie getting rid of all of his old speeches." Because he'd always been a critic of the president. Taft, the Senate Majority Leader, dies August of 1953. March the 1st, 1954, Halleck, the House Majority Leader, misses getting shot when the Puerto Ricans come into the House and start shooting in the House of Representatives. It hit his desk, and he only got missed by 10 inches. That was something I never knew. I never heard him talk about that. I never heard anybody else ever talk about that. But he was only missed by 10 inches in that when they were firing around, at random in the House. He gets 1954. He's the honorary Doctor of Law degrees from St. Joseph's College. He defeats his opponent James Berg by 23,000 votes. The Republicans lose the House, and everybody thought, well, now Charlie will be minority leader. But Joe Martin, who was an old man, Beth Conrad told me, and he was an old man. He wasn't real energetic, and Charlie Halleck was energetic. But anyway, Joe Martin went back on his word. And he had always said that if he had been speaker, and he would not come back to be minority leader again. And so he went back on his word, and because of Eisenhower didn't want any problems with the Congress, the White House asked Charlie not to challenge him in that decision. And so Halleck had to wait a while before he challenged Joe Martin for that position. In 1956, Halleck was selected by Ike to deliver his nomination speech at the convention. Mrs. Halleck said, quote, "It was the most thrilling performance I ever saw Charlie give. I was so excited, I sat there almost like a bobby soxer." In that campaign in 56, Charlie Halleck had a special airplane. He logged 15,000 miles in 2 weeks. He was in 20 states, 30 congressional districts, and his stump speech there was, "Instead of war, debt, scandal, and radicalism, the Republican Eisenhower administration has brought peace, progress, and unprecedented payrolls." Notice the P's. He wins at home 94,000 to 54,000. So now he's up to 40,000. 1957, he could have been the Republican National Chairman. He turned down the job to be Vice President of Pennsylvania Railroad at $40,000 a year. About that time, Bill Jenner, who was a senator, and some conservative Indiana Republicans came to Washington and wanted Halleck to step down. They said he was too close to Ike. Now here's Eisenhower as the president, and we got a man that's right there next to him, and these guys wanted him to step down. And so I guess Halleck got him in his office, and he got on him, and by the time he got done with him, why, Jenner decided he didn't need to run anymore, and he really did him in. In 1958, he only carried by 6,000 votes. That was the closest election he had after the first two. He was elected minority leader over Martin. And he had this small office that he became famous in Washington for called the Clinic. And Joe Martin called it Charlie's Drinking Room. And he had who was the guy that was here at Kenny the last time that spoke? Larry, what was his name? He said he'd been in that room. Larry Carter said he'd been in that room, and he said that Charlie had cartoons, all the cartoons, about himself that he got in the Washington paper and everything, had it in there, and he said it was a drinking room, and had a few bottles in it and so forth. March 10th, 1960, 1,000 people gathered to honor the Hoosier of the Year. It's the Indiana Society in Washington, D.C. Eisenhower shows up and speaks. He said, and this is a quote, he said, "Charlie Halleck's loyalty to me has cost him votes in his own district. That kind of loyalty is priceless, and I know it." In 1960, they balanced the budget. Halleck, Eisenhower, they balanced the budget. 1960 campaign, Truman said, "The Democratic National Convention has been rigged for Jack Kennedy." Halleck said, quote, "For once I agree with Truman." He was the permanent chair for the convention, so that kept him, he was the presiding officer for the convention in 1960 in Chicago. That kept him from running for vice president. He stayed at home this time. After the convention, he stayed at home, and he whipped his opponent by 25,000 votes. The Ev and Charlie show, once Kennedy gets elected in 60, then Irv Dirksen and Charlie Halleck had a television show. And it was called by the Washington Press, the Irv and Charlie show. But it was really called the Joint Senate House Republican Leadership Press Conferences. There were 22 held the first year. And Dirksen and Halleck are competing against Camelot. The Kennedys are photogenic, nice-looking people, dynamic, charismatic, and here you got Halleck and Dirksen. And so they took there was fun made of them. And Halleck said, one time he said, listen, and this is a quote, "I'm no clown, and I don't care to be cast in that character. If you read the transcript of the things we've been talking about, you will find they certainly are on the serious side." The second year they got Nixon and Eisenhower and others were brought in, and it was a very effective minority tool against the Kennedy administration. (1962), Eisenhower comes to Rensselaer. I can tell you a couple things there. I was teaching at DeMotte, and I remember that day very well because I wanted Jim Fritsch, who I think still lives here in Rensselaer, was superintendent of schools here. I asked him if I could go, and he said no. And so I thought about it for a little while. See, I was a company commander of the National Guard unit here, and they had a role. They were going to be honor guard for Eisenhower and had some parking, traffic control things and so forth and so on. So I thought about it a little while, so I went back and I said, well, what about if I make it a field trip? And he said, well, you can go. So I loaded 57 seniors up from DeMotte High School and brought them down here, and I can remember where I parked the bus. I parked the bus over there where the barber shop is now, and I said, okay, now you guys are on your own, I'll see you. I went over to the armory, got my uniform on, did my thing, had a wonderful time. I remember particularly Eisenhower, but I remember more, I think, the chickens and the way they roasted them out there in the football field at St. Joe. Unbelievable. There's 30,000 people showed up, and according to the record, there are 16,000 chickens that were barbecued. 1959 and 1962, Halleck, is collecting the rewards from a very successful career. His Doctor of Law at Indiana University, his Indiana University's Distinguished Service Award, the Good Government Award from the Good Government Society. But the young Republicans are organizing in the House behind Jerry Ford. And they replaced Charles Hovren, who was from Missouri, and the chair of the Republican Conference. They got one guy in. And then Halleck worked to support civil rights legislation, and he worked this for Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson, when he became president, he and Halleck were personal friends, and I think Carol will bring this up later. And less than 2 weeks after Kennedy's assassination, Halleck is invited to have breakfast at the White House, and when the Cadillac pulls up, the limousine pulls up, guess who's in the limousine? It's Johnson. He comes, a great politician. And so he and Charlie, he helps Charlie, gets him over to the White House. And Charlie Halleck liked thick bacon, and Lyndon Johnson knew it. So whenever Charlie Halleck came to the White House for breakfast, well, they had the extra thick bacon, just the way Charlie wanted it. So he got his support. Purdue was given $410,000 for jet propulsion, and $840,000 for rocket firing lab. In 1964, friends wanted him to run him for president. And he said, all I want to do is be Speaker of the House. At the convention, he introduced he introduced Ike, and he seconded Goldwater. The Democratic candidate for this district was a guy by the name of John Raber. He had been president of the Indiana Farmers Union. So he got the bright idea that what he would do, he would go around the district and pass out popcorn. Well, it kind of backfired on him. First of all, the Democrats didn't like him, and they gave him the job because he knew he couldn't win. And then the first time he passed out popcorn, he did it at the West Lafayette football boosters. Well, they were selling popcorn there that night, and they were wanting to buy new uniforms for the football team, and so he was out there passing out free popcorn, and it made all the people in West Lafayette mad. And so he passed out 140,000 bags of popcorn, 2.5 tons of corn, and 2 tons of cocoa butter. I don't know what the nutritional people would say about that now. But anyway, Halleck closed his campaign in Delphi, and he said, he predicted that we're going to win in spite of popcorn. And he said, the medical experts tell me that popcorn causes runs. I've talked too long, but he runs one more time. When he retired from Congress, he was 68 years old, 34 years in the Congress, and he had half his life had been in Congress. I tell my students, I talk each year to my students about Charlie Halleck, because the main street in DeMotte is Halleck Street. And it seems to me, I think this is the best way that I can explain it. We had a girl up there by the name of Celeste Sussness that won the state cross-country meet, I think 3 years in a row, 2 or 3 years in a row. But here's the thing, every time she set a record for Indiana. She is the fastest girl ever to put on sneakers in Indiana. And I explain to my students, I say, that is truly unusual. When you find somebody that is the best ever in anything for the state of Indiana, that is a remarkable feat. And I don't think, in my judgment, there has ever been a legislator that could equal or even come close to what Charlie Halleck accomplished and what he did in his 34 years in the House of Representatives. And so, you know, he truly, in my judgment, and I think a lot of other people's judgment, and I think history will be the judge, he is truly the most outstanding legislator that Indiana has ever sent to the Congress. We beseech these two friends up in West Point to help out, and former friends now.
Right. Thanks a lot.
But the way I got into this thing was because Jim Beaver called me and told me that, said, you know, we've recommended you to do this, and I still think that Jim's job.
You did a bang-up job.
So anyway,
Great.
so Carol, why don't you start out with a little story about Charlie?
Okay, well, when we got out of law school, we helped manage a congressional campaign. It was the second one, actually. No, it was the first one after Charlie had retired. And Jim and I were really thinking we were going to head for Colorado and work out there and see what we could, just see the country before we settled down. So we went up to Valpo, worked on a campaign, went to Washington, D.C., and he was administrative assistant on the Hill. And we had a lot of good times there, but we take a break once in a while and go to Florida and go fishing, and invariably we stop and visit with Charlie down there. And Jim was talking to him one day, and Jim said, I want to get back home to Rensselaer, raise the kids, get out of this crime-infested capital, and get back to Rensselaer and get going. And Charlie said, well, if you ever need any help or anybody, he said, I've done a few trials in my life. He said, I'd have some fun. And Jim said, are you kidding? He said, no, I'd like to join forces. So we did. We came back in 1970, and we had him for 16 years. In the early years, he always had every intention of practicing law, but he seemed to be busy doing other things, and we just let him go. And we were trying to get going ourselves. But he was in there every day getting his mail. That was the highlight of his day. Later years, when he couldn't get out of the car, he'd pull that big thing up out in front and lay on the horn. And that big Cadillac horn, I mean, the whole town hears it. And if I were on the phone, I just was going nuts because he wouldn't get off the horn. But anyway, he was fun to have around, needless to say. And we would get, those first couple of years, we would get, every once in a while we'd get a call, and I'd answer the phone, and it'd be Lady Bird calling from Florida, or from Texas. saying, so I put her on with Charlie, he happened to be there for his mail, and she'd say, come on down, we're having a barbecue. We're gonna get John Swearingen out of Chicago, he was the head of the Amoco, ahead of Amoco. In fact, he had the big new Standard Oil building in Chicago. So we'd get Charlie to Chicago, and he'd hop in Swearingen's plane, and they'd head off for the ranch. And Lyndon would be there picking him up, and then they'd have to tour the ranch. He always liked to tour the ranch with all of his guests that came in for the barbecues. And they just had a great time. They were close friends. They were on different sides of the fence, but he always said he could work with Lyndon because he was a man of his word. He knew where he stood on different things, and they got things done. Not always the way each other wanted them, but they were there to help each other. So I just thought I'd relay a little bit of that. I don't know, I didn't hear everything tonight, but he was majority leader, I believe, only from 47 to 53, because there was a long drought in his 34 years of his being in the minority. And he said he felt like a bantam rooster in a barn lot full of Clydesdales. He said dodging those flying Democratic hooves in those days was no picnic. But anyway, we haven't had, since Charlie was majority leader back in 53, we didn't have a Republican majority leader till Dick Armey got in recently. So it was a long drought. But anyway, during the time Charlie was majority leader, he was also in charge of the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, where he would go out and try to recruit some good Republicans in order to beat the Democrats to get them in Congress, to build up the ranks. And one of them that he went after was a guy that most of them really had never heard of, was Richard Nixon out of California. Well, a lot of the people in the committee and his friends, for some reason, they just weren't interested in Nixon, but Charlie nevertheless went after him, got him, recruited him, and he got elected. Then Charlie got him on the committees where he thought he could be a shining star, and he rose through the ranks. He said eventually he hoped that he could ride the big white horse, is the way he put it. So they were also good friends and worked together. And when Nixon was finally president, Charlie went over to the White House one day and he looked around at all the aides that surrounded Nixon, and he didn't know any of them. And so he spoke to him later, and he told him, he said, Mr. President, he said, if I don't know any of these guys, they shouldn't be here. He just didn't want them there. And about 6 months later, Watergate broke out. So I think Nixon should have heeded his advice and maybe cleaned house a little earlier. Just a little tidbit, Charlie liked to play golf, and of course he was close friends with Ike, and they played out at Burning Tree Country Club there in Washington, D.C. And Charlie went out one day to play golf with somebody. Maybe it was Nixon. He might have been trying, no, it wasn't. Anyway, he went out to play, and his stuff the equipment wasn't where it always was. Well, he raised holy hell. And by God, I can't play golf, where's my stuff? So the pro kind of said, come here, follow me, I'll get you taken care of. So he took him over, and they went to a little room, and there were only 2 lockers in this little private room. And he said, because Charlie was still stomping, and he looked, and 2 lockers, what is this? And he said, well, President Eisenhower requested that the 2 of you have your lockers in this special little room. And then he said, one of the few times in his life he felt humble. So, we traveled up and down the roads with him, going to all the chicken dinners for many years, and goodness sakes, I wish I remembered everything now that he said. But he was saying on one of the latter times, he said, Carol, he said, things are a hell of a lot easier now. He said, we used to have to go out west and stuff for these guys. And he said, you hear how I've covered all these states and everything, but he said, the West was really pretty rough back in those days. And he said to fly out there in those old DC-3s in the wintertime, he said, they didn't have these de-icing things now. He said, those wings got pretty darn heavy. And he said, there were times, many a time, they weren't quite sure they were even going to get where they were going, but they did. And he said, the one time he got upstaged, he was in a saloon out west, giving one of his big speeches, and he thought he was just doing pretty darn good. And he said, until, he said, the doors flew open and a guy came in on a horse. And he said he didn't know if he scored more or the horse did that night. But anyway, we had a lot of good times with him. A lot of good times. Good memories. That's my little spiel, I guess.
Well, it's a hard act to follow.
Oh, yeah.
My experiences were more limited probably after Charlie really got out of Congress. He really didn't have any clout, so to speak. But one of my first experiences with Charlie was going down to a state fundraiser dinner in Indianapolis. And that was kind of my first introduction into politics after I'd been married, because my wife was involved, and Jim and Carol were going to go down. My wife had already gone down, and we met at Charlie's house, and the big back Cadillac, of course. And I'd been baling hay, and came, and as usual, I was a little bit late, and Charlie, he came out of the house, and ended up, Jim and Carol were going to be in the front seat, Charlie and I in the back seat, and he brings his little igloo out with his ginger ale and sets in there. But he also had a container with some ginger ale in it, and he'd forgotten something in the house, so he set that up on the roof of the car. And if you know where Charlie used to live out here in the Thompson edition, why, Jim, he backs out the drive and takes off west down the street, Stewart Drive, and gets up to Bell and pulls up to 114, and Charlie, he let out a war whoop. He said, "Beebe," he said, "what did you do with my drink?" Well, he said, "I think you had it." "Yeah," Carol said, "you had it, Jim, or Charlie, when you came out of the house." And believe it or not, I mean, that's probably a good quarter of a mile or more. So Carol hops out of the car, and sure enough, there sits his glass on the roof of the car. And we'd driven about 3 or 4 blocks already. But of all the trips ever went to Indianapolis, that was the fastest one I ever made. I mean, not that we're going speeding, but with Charlie telling about all of his hill stories. Just entertained me to no end. That little country bumpkin that never been associated with a congressman or an ex-congressman, you know, and hearing all these stories for the first time was just amazing. And of course, you know, he had a captive audience there, so I got the full load and enjoyed every second of it. But all the way down there, he'd reminisce about all these stories and the like, and he'd say, "Now, Beebe, you're driving a little bit fast. You know, I don't have any connections anymore." And, you know, by golly, you know, he had connections, and we made it down there without any problem. But there was a big old guy there that was, I think that's probably one of the first times at the convention center. And we pulled up there, and this guy stuck his head in there, you know, no parking. Well, Jim was going to let us out and go park the car, and this guy stuck his head in there. Congressman Halleck, you know. And here's a guy in downtown Indianapolis that probably nobody had ever heard of, and he knew Charlie Halleck. So that was kind of an experience that I was very fond of, and later on we made a trip over to Fort Wayne. Nixon was making a speech over there, and Ray Beaver, Jim's father, was the party chairman, and my wife was involved. So Charlie had this little flare-up and was not allowed to go very far by himself. And so Ray Beaver closed up shop that day, and he and Jeanette and Charlie and Blanche went in one car, and Garrett and Gretchen Van Keppel and my wife and I went in the other car for Fort Wayne. We were going to hear Nixon. Well, they had 2 VIP seats, and we get there and find out that these 2 VIP seats are for Charlie and Blanche. Well, Ray Beaver, you know, he's going to capitalize on everything he can too. And he said, "You know, Charlie," said, "I just don't think you should be alone." So Garrett Van Keppel and I, we got the duty of escorting Mommy up a ramp and into a place, and she just screamed all the time that she's up there. You know, I've never been this far away from my husband at a political function before in my life. And she's very upset, and she just growled the whole time. But on the way back, we stopped at Warsaw. And at that time, Cosgrove County, the complete county, was in the 2nd Congressional District. And Charlie had represented those people numerous times. And, I mean, he's given directions to Ray to pull in there, you know, and we pull into this place, and a little snow on the ground, and it's about 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, and you know, the lights are coming down, and this place is closed, Charlie, we can't go in here. I've been here before, they'll take care of us. So we go up, and the door wasn't locked, and we go in, and, you know, they are cleaning up and the like. And out comes this lady, and she said, Congressman Halleck, come on in. Well, it said, you're serving, aren't you? Well, no, we're not, but we will for you. So the lights come back on, you know, we sat down at a big table, and we had a nice dinner and stayed there till probably 11 o'clock or so. But those kind of situations, for a little guy like me, impressed me. I mean, you know, this is after the fact. We had a neighbor one time, and in fact it was Natalie's uncle that was in the Air Force, and he had some serious health problems. And Charlie was very active. And this Lawson Whaling's father came down to my dad one day, and he said, you know, Lawson's not in very good shape. And he said, he's on active duty, and he said he needs to be got into a hospital. He said, what would you suggest we do? He said, call Charlie Halleck. And in something like 72 hours or less, Lawson Whaling was in a hospital in California. I mean, you know, things happen. And I guess my initial introduction to Charlie was through my wife before we were married. In fact, she was a senior in high school, and I would stop down to 303 South Front Street to visit her one evening, and she was working on an English lesson. And Lib Kressler was they had a college English course. And she thought, and I still hear about that course in some of my conversation with her because I don't use the proper grammar at times. But nevertheless, Charlie came down to see her father, who happened to be the party chairman at that time. And this was on a Friday evening. And as he ventured through the dining room where she was working on her, whatever she was writing there, Charlie, such and such a word, he said, is spelled wrong. I mean, he just glanced down there, never stopped walking, and right on in the kitchen. So she goes against the dictionary, and sure enough, Charlie was right. And so then I was introduced to Charlie Halleck, but, you know, that was in 1955. So a lot of things have happened, but, you know, those kind of situations are nationwide, and certainly, you know, the people closest to Charlie probably respected him the least. Because he was such a statesman, he was a national figure. You know, in this day and age, with all the special interest groups, Charlie could not have functioned. I mean, he'd have absolutely blown his mind to think that you had a little special interest group running around here, wanting this, wanting that, you know. And he could go to bat for anybody in the country and get a lot of things done. We had some business dealings with the people in Montana, and they heard of Charlie Halleck. I mean, and he may not have ever been to the state of Montana, but you know, there was 500,000 people in the whole state, so they knew pretty well how things were done. And certainly, you know, Charlie Halleck was a big name to them, and they came to visit one time, and they wanted to see Charlie Halleck's place. And that's when he lived down here in Warner Street, or whatever street it is, down here toward the greenhouse. But at any rate, they couldn't believe that, you know, here's a national prominent guy living in a little two-story frame house in Rensselaer, Indiana. But that was Charlie Halleck.
Yeah, we have people stop through the office every once in a while, like a salesman coming out from out of state, and they'll, you know, apologize for coming in, but they said, I'm just really curious, is this any relative on your window, is that any relative of the congressman? I said, that is, or was the congressman. And they're just, you know, oh, yes.
Well, I just heard one side of the conversation. I was in Beaver's law office today, and I think there was a conversation that somebody called for Mr. Halleck or Mr. Beaver, you know, and had a legal question. You know, and I don't know how far away that would be, but, you know, how long has Charlie been out of the office? It, you know,
86.
86, and, you know, people are still calling for it. You brought up something a while ago that reminded me of a story about Harriet Shedd. We used to farm for Harriet Shedd, and she told about Charles Abraham Halleck numerous times. And one of the stories that I really remember, it was really funny. I mean, and she thought it was funny then, but at the time it wasn't too funny. There was 3 or 4 boys in the back of this class that she was conducting, and they keep handing something back and forth. So she was back there, and happened to be that Charles Abraham had what, I mean, he had his hands together, you know, and she said, "Charles Abraham Halleck, give me what you have in your hand." She held out her hand and he dropped a mouse in there. So he was a delicate guy, for sure. So, you know, we could go on with stories, and Jerry Hoover is a guy that's kind of a walking encyclopedia of a lot of history, and he's done his homework well for Charlie Halleck. And, you know, I think it would behoove the children, the young men and women that are in Kankakee Valley to take heed to a lot of his upbringing. And if they could use that in life, would probably make better citizens. And not take anything away from Jerry McKim. I mean, likewise there. I mean, you know, your grassroots people that are here and know what the system's all about. And certainly I think this history lesson that they should be getting is probably going over their head because they're thinking about maybe a mouse to be teacher or something else. So I'll turn the program back to Wally.
Well, I got a couple stories here. I got one. When I started when I knew I was getting the job at DeMotte, he was in the restaurant scene, and he said, "Jerry," he said, "I hear you're going up to DeMotte." I said, "Well, that's what it looks like." He said, "Well, let me tell you something." He said, "I'll tell you a little story here." He said that you want to keep in mind because he said, "You'll need this." He said, in 1934 or 1935, I was campaigning for prosecuting attorney in Hanging Grove Township, and I got the word that there was a riot in DeMotte. He said, so I got up there just as quick as I could, and he said, as I rounded that corner, he said, I saw, he said, there must have been 25 to 30 big Dutchmen, he said, standing in front of the cheese factory. And he said there was 8 Teamsters standing there, and he said they were going to make these farmers bring their milk and cream into the creamery with Teamsters. And he said, so he said, I looked them over, he said there was a 6'5" Groot, and a 6'6" Hamstra, and a 6'4" Zelstra, and he said, so I want to tell you something about those Dutchmen. He said, ears get red. He said, they're getting mad. He said, I looked them over and he said, by God, all of them had red ears. And he said, I quickly sized up the situation and I told those Teamsters to get in their car and get the hell out of Jasper County. He said they had no right to be there. He said the last time I saw them, he said they was going north over those railroad tracks, the black smoke rolling out of their car, and he said, you know. So anyway, some guy was there with him said, well, Charlie, you couldn't do that today. And he said, I want to tell you something, my friend. He said, if it was today, and he said, I rounded the corner and saw about 40 big Dutchmen with a 6'6" Hamstra, a 6'5" Groot, and a 6'4" Zelstra, and their ears were red. He said, I'd tell those Teamsters to get in their car and get the hell out of Jasper County. Because he said, let me tell you something. He said, I carried Keener Township that time, my 232 to 44 votes. And so I remembered that, and I went up there and coached, and we come down here and they'd never won a sectional, and Rensselaer, of course, delighted in that. And the first year it come, well, we weren't very good and had a bunch of juniors. We come down here and out there at the St. Joe Fieldhouse, we're down in that little locker room, and those Rensselaer guys are up there yelling, go home tulips, stomp those tulips, bash those Dutchmen, all this stuff, see, and we just went out there and played terrible. So by guys, the second year, we come down here, and every one of them was Dutchmen, Seatsman, Bozeman, and Schoonville, and all Dutchmen, and so I made up my mind I was going to see if their ears would get red. I got them back there in that locker room, and I raised, it was awful. but I got their ears red. And when they went out there, they jumped on people. I mean, it was kicked people around awful bad. And so I can testify, he wasn't wrong. You get a Dutchman's ears red, and he's about ready to do some damage to you. I got one more story. I went to teach here at DeMotte, and you know, it's like Kenny said, he was in the restaurant all the time, and it was he was a person I knew, and so forth. And one day the principal come running up the stairs, and he said, Halleck's on the phone for you. You know, so I go down there. They said, wait 1 minute for the House Minority Leader, whatever the hell it was. You know. He gets on the phone, he said, Jerry, what in the hell's the matter down at the Armory? I was a company commander here, you know, and I said, well, I don't know, Congressman, what? And he said, well, you know, I called down there and they told me that we couldn't have our annual bean supper down at the Armory. He said, we've had a bean supper down there now for 18 years. And he said, we got to resurrect old Abe. And he said, they tell me that the furnace is out. He said, what in the hell's going on? And so I said, well, you know, the furnace, the oil went out and it was 20 below zero and cracked all the radiators and everything. And so I told him the story, and he said, well, he said, and I've been calling Indianapolis, and I was talking to a guy by the name of Tritch. I remember this guy's name. His name's Colonel Tritch. And every time I called him, you know, he'd say, well, Lieutenant, we're working on that, but there isn't. Said, we don't have money. And he said, so you're just going to have to get along with the cold armory until we can get some money. And so I told Charlie what he said. He said, well, by God, you call him up and you tell him that I want the place for him. And he said, if you've got a problem, you tell him that if there's a problem, that I'll call him. So I said, well, okay. So I called up this Tritch, you know, and he says, yes, Lieutenant, what can I do for you? And I said, well, I just got a call from Charlie Halleck, and he wants to have a bean dinner up here. He said he's been doing it for 16 or 18, whatever he told me, years. And I said, you know, that place is cold. And he said, if you know, for me to call, and if something didn't happen, well, that he could call. And he said, what are you going to be doing tomorrow morning? You know, he and some captain come up here, and I swear to God, they was putting, all of this money thing went right out the window, and they put a furnace in that old armory there. It wasn't worth, it was falling down, and they put a furnace in that thing on Sunday. They was in there, you know, carrying furnace parts in, so, because they didn't want to catch his wrath. So I figured out right then, you know, that he really had clout, because he, you know, as soon as I said Halleck, that guy said, well, where are you going to be tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock? I'll meet you there.
Did you mention anything about his mother? I think Laura was his mother,
Yeah.
and I think something that's kind of neat was that she was an attorney. Back in 1900, and she did a lot of abstracting, and her name still comes up in the abstracts when we go through them, and that's kind of neat for a female attorney 100 years ago. I just thought that was...
I'd like to go a step farther on that stomping you guys gave Rensselaer, that sectional game that night.
What year was this?
Well,
It must have been 63 or something.
right in the
Pretty close,
60s
yeah.
or sometime, but some of these people probably don't remember Lefty Clark, but Lefty Clark was a newspaper man down here at the Rensselaer Republican. And, I mean, anything to promote Rensselaer or Jasper County, he was for. But he wrote the sports line for that sectional, and just a year ago, it was brought up to me that, you know, they never, from Rensselaer, would give DeMotte their due. Okay, they have this big sectional finals out there at St. Phil on Saturday. Monday's headlines, guess what they read? Rensselaer loses sectional. They wouldn't give DeMotte the credit for winning. Rensselaer loses sectional. That was you that caused all that.
Oh, that's cute. Oh.
Who else here got a story about Charlie Halleck?
Well, I have one.
Good.
I thought tonight when we were coming, I had to think of this story. My husband Ken is a mailman here in town. He works in the post office, but he used to carry mail. And in the 70s, he was carrying mail. When you mentioned that, it really made me think about Ken one time. He said sometimes Charlie kind of knew when the mail was due.
Certainly.
And quite often when Ken was carrying the route uptown, Charlie's Cadillac would pull up and Ken would deliver him his mail into
Through
the
the
car window. And they'd chit-chat and they'd go on. Well, one day he gave him his mail and he went on down the route and he said, oh, a block or two later, the Cadillac pulls up, honk, 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 and Ken goes over and he says, hey, young man, I didn't get my Social Security check today. And Ken says, well, I gave you all your mail. And he said, well, when you get back to the post office, why don't you check? Because I'm supposed to have my Social Security check today. Ken said he wasn't there. Came the next day. But he said he was looking for his Social Security check. He was just like everybody else.
When they buried Roy Conrad, I didn't go to the funeral, but my mother was there. And he said they kept waiting. They held up the funeral, for a while. And he came in, and he had arthritis, and he was really, really hurting. And he said, he came in and had a chair right by Beth so he could sit right up in front. He turned around and he said, looked at the people that was there, and he said, it's hell to get old.
Yeah. He always said in latter years that his only social thing was going to his friends' funerals. That's the only social outings he had.
How old was he when he passed away? Carol?
85.
Yeah,
85.
yeah, he was born in 1900.
That's right, you said that.
Well, every time you tell a story, it reminds you of another story. And when Charlie had their funeral, it was out to the chapel at the college. And, of course, Jacksons were in charge. And Tom Paget called me up right after Charlie passed away, and he said that the funeral was going to be out at the chapel. And he said, I'm sure that you know some of these political cronies that Charlie's had. And he said, could you come out to the chapel early that morning? And he said, we're going to have some special seating for all of his dignitaries. So, I mean, here I am, talking to this guy, talk to that guy, and somebody comes in, well, that's Congressman Hellis, or that's Congressman Myers. So they escort him up there and set him down. And some little old scrawny guy came up and he said, are you in charge of this funeral? He said, are you Mr. Jackson? I said, no, I don't have anything to do with that. I said, I'm just a friend of the family, and they asked me to be out here and kind of support some of the dignitaries and show you where they could go. He said, well, just the way you're directing traffic, I thought you were probably conducting this funeral. And I thought, that's the farthest thing from my mind. I was just trying to be kind and help out and be accused of being an undertaker. But the flip side of that was, when Charlie was in leadership in Washington, of course, and I don't know what still happens or not, but the leadership got the limousine. And the limousine driver was Fraser. And I remember Bill Miller was a friend of mine, and his dad and his folks went out there, Earl, when Charlie was in leadership, and I think Earl was the county commissioner, and these people are from Rensselaer. They're Jasper counties. Fraser, take care of them. So anybody from Rensselaer went out there, or the 2nd District, Fraser took care of them. And I'd always heard the story about Fraser. Well, Fraser, of course, was a black man, but real kind of a mulatto color. And Fraser came to Charlie's funeral. And, of course, I kind of recognized him and heard some people talking, and really a sharp guy. And at any rate, he had heard about Jasper County, he heard about Rensselaer, he heard about Kenny Kaufman, Jim Beaver and Carol Beaver and all that, And he was making some acquaintance to people that he had heard their name. And he thought that was kind of nice guy too. But Fraser moved up to head doorman, which Charlie got him that job for the house. I mean, you talk about taking care of his people. I mean, he was on his way out, but he saw to it that Fraser got a permanent position as head doorman, which, I mean, that was a lot better than being a limousine driver. So he took care of his people, for sure.
Back in 1963, September, I went on the radio by accident. And I think it was in the spring of '64, and you and I talked about it once. I think it was a Lincoln Day dinner. And Congressman Halleck had a young representative by the name of Dole. he was speaking. You remember?
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, radio was exciting then because there wasn't much radio around, and the radio station in Rensselaer was new. And Congressman Halleck brought then Representative Dole out to the station, the one that's on the highway, the old station. And I got to interview them, and I was thrilled. I couldn't believe that. I didn't know Dole. He was just another representative, but Charlie Halleck really, I was really flattered to think they wanted to be on radio, that somebody arranged it and they'd come out and be interviewed. Now
That brings another story up about Dole, whether I shared this with you or not. But we were in Indianapolis to a political function a few years ago. I mean, it was then Senator Dole. And Senator Dole tells a story about being invited by Charlie Halleck to a small rural county in northern Indiana to be the keynote speaker at their annual resurrection of AIDS. And he said, believe it or not, he said things were so tough, they were so bad, they could not sell tickets because nobody had heard of Bob Dole, that the party chairman, who was at that time Ed Nussbaum, they got some tickets printed up and they're going to raffle off a television. I mean, they're raffling television to try to get people to come to hear Bob Dole. And he relates this story to about 1,500 people down there, and, you know, they were all eating it up. Well, I couldn't wait till the program was over, so I'd go up and tell Bob Dole that I was at that Lincoln Day. And, you know, I thought he was a great guy then. I think he's even better now. But how little insignificant things, you know, and he's probably told that story all over the United States about, you know, not being very popular, nobody knew it, nobody heard of it, had to tell television to get people to show up.
TV rap.
Yeah. And at that time, I mean, that was a big deal for television because very few people had it.
Kenny, it was interesting to hear your aspect there on the military part from Lawson Whaling, because it kind of rang a bell with me, because my brother Bob, who was in the service at the same time as I was, we were both in Wichita Falls, Texas at the time, in the Air Force, and I was online with the program that I wanted to be involved with, but he was getting pulled around a little bit, out of shape into the wrong area of what he wasn't supposed to be in at all. And so he just happened to mention one time to, I guess, in a letter or on a telephone conversation to my dad here in Rensselaer about what was going on, and the recruiter that had signed us up, you know, for the service at the time had not come through with the promise that he had made, and it was in writing. It wasn't just in a verbal, it was in writing as to what field he was supposed to be in. So Dad said, well, sometime maybe we'll see what we can do about it, you know. And so it happened to be Charlie Halleck. Happened to come across him one time, and so he just happened to mention it to Charlie. And it wasn't too long but what the colonel on the base got a call, and they called Bob in. Of course, he was, as I was, an enlisted man at the time, and he said, young man, he says, I don't know who you happen to know in this country, but he says, I have orders here to tell you you can go anywhere you want in the United States or wherever, and you can go into whatever field you want to at this point in time. So what would you like to do, and where would you like to go? So he told him he said what field he wanted to go into, what he had really signed up for, and that's all he was asking for. And he wanted to go to Grissom, well, it was Bunker Hill Air Force Base at the time. So by golly, it wasn't too darn long. He was over at Bunker Hill Air Force Base. And I think Charlie had just a tad bit to do with that. And it wasn't really, it couldn't have gotten done by any other person or any other way. It just wasn't going to happen at the time. And so I think it was kind of interesting, you know, to see that the clout that he had with someone, you know, even back in the mid-'60s, because that was in 1966. So, you know, he knew people even at that time, and that was toward the end of his, you know, his career, you know, as a congressman. And so it's there's no doubt the gentleman definitely had a lot of clout in the country, and
Well, I think one thing that impressed me about the guy, you know, that he really was a patriot. He really loved this country. You can say what you want to, but I mean, you know, little things. I remember him saying that there was some blacksmith here. We were sitting. When I say we, I'm carrying the drinks and so forth and so on. But he was sitting on 4th of July in the Sportsman, and he said, "What's happened to the 4th of July?" He said, "What's happened to the 4th of July?" He said, "When I was a boy, there was some blacksmith here in Rensselaer."
Russell Patton.
Anyway, he said, "I'll tell you what he did. He took and put gunpowder on that anvil of his." And he said, by God, he said, he hit that anvil, and he said you could hear it all over Rensselaer. And he said, we knew it was the 4th of July. He said, but see, you know, he said we should celebrate the independence. He said, this is not right the way we're doing it now. You know, I just think, I think he was really a patriot and really loved the country and really, you know, had a great sense of duty and honor. He told me one other time, when I first was company commander here, he told me, he said, we didn't have enough strength, didn't have enough people. And he said, so I told him that. And he said, oh, by gosh, Jerry, he said, don't you tell me that Rensselaer isn't a good guard town. He said, I'll tell you what, in World War I, he said, they backed the train up, and he said, every doctor and every lawyer in Rensselaer got on that train and they left. And that's what he told me. He said, in World War I, he said, so don't tell me that Rensselaer is a bad guard town. He said, they're a good guard town.
I found one of his speeches today. I should have brought it. The patriotism came through, and but this I found, I didn't even read the whole thing, but it was interesting because the speech would have applied today of keeping big government out of the little guy's business. You know, he said there's some things we have to do to help you, but you need to help yourselves. And I mean, it could have been read today.
And it wasn't very big then, neither was it.
Right,
So.
right.
We're about out of time. I get up early, I told you. I want to thank you, panel people, and the rest of you for coming. I really enjoyed it. Jerry does such a good job, and so does Kenny and Carol. Next week, it's going to have a Democratic flavor. Mike Riley, is going to talk about the Kennedy campaign that he was campaign manager for in Indianapolis. If you're around Mike, you know he can tell stories. And that will be next week's lesson. And following that, it will be history of Jasper County politics, and Kenny Culp will be back, and Mike Riley talking about history here in Jasper County, and maybe some other people too. So, meeting adjourned, and if you want to talk to some of the speakers.